Welcome to the Lote Notes podcast, your briefing on the latest in fire, security, and cyber events shaping today's world. Each episode, we break down the stories behind the headlines, explore emerging risks, and bring clarity to the fast-moving landscape of safety and security. Whether it's real-world incidents, digital threats, or industry trends, we keep you informed, prepared, and ahead of the curve. Let's dive into this week's developments.
Today, we are diving into the backbone of our digital life. Joining me is Ameeraa Hussain, a Lote security consultant, and who's co-authored this new article that we're looking at for data centers, SOCI, and the new risk landscape. Ameeraa, it's great to have you on this podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Magrabi. It's a fascinating, if not slightly terrifying time to be looking at critical infrastructure.
Yeah, so let's start with that and why you focused on data centers. You called them a cornerstone. That's a heavy word.
Well, to be honest, I think it's a very accurate one, especially during these times. Over the past 3 years, investment in data centers have surged by around 65%. So they're not just buildings anymore full of servers. They're the backbone of national security, the power grid, and even our water systems.
Yep.
Especially in the current landscape in 2026, where there's a massive outage of hyperscale cloud facilities, and a single point of failure could paralyze almost every sector simultaneously.
Yeah, indeed. And that, I think that dependency and that single point of failure is quite frightening because it creates this domino effect where there's a whole lot of services that are dependent on that one data center or that one hyperscale environment. And that's exactly why we've got the SOCI, or the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, and that's why it is so important. But I think more importantly, we've also just seen the results of a 2026 independent review that was conducted by Dr. Jill Slay. It wasn't exactly a glowing report for the status quo.
No, it wasn't. So I was actually having a read over it today. And the more I read it, the more I can just see how SOCI, honestly, it's a very big thing that needs to be addressed. And there are strengths of the SOCI Act, and it also has weaknesses. So it has successfully raised executive and board level awareness, and it's also found that 70% of the industry has negative things to say about SOCI.
Wow, 70%. That's a big number, and it's certainly a lot of friction. But why do you think there's so much of pushback?
I think the biggest thing for this pushback is the complexity surrounding the Act, and something that Dr. Slay called regulatory duplication. So a lot of requirements within SOCI have also been mentioned in previous regulations, but the SOCI Act has reframed this, so that creates complexity for operators since they're not really sure which regulation they should comply with.
Yeah.
And they also are overwhelmed because the SOCI Act heavily focuses on cybersecurity. But this is a very important thing, but however, focusing solely on cybersecurity can miss things in the bigger picture. The review also found that the current penalties, they're toothless. They don't really do much.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, and I think with one of the words that Dr. Slay brings out is that there's a lot of confusion out there as well in terms of what exactly is required within this regulatory framework. Cyber heavy indeed, and I think that cyber focus sometimes takes away from really big risks, some of them being physical security risks, the cyber physical side of risk, which often gets ignored, and then you've got the big ticket items like personnel risks and supply chain risks, which completely get missed when you're purely looking at cyber from an IT risk perspective. And I think that was probably another area as well where Dr. Slay brought it home in her report in terms of the need for more of an OT focus from an operational technologies focus, and also within Australia the demand to have greater skill levels within this OT segment as well.
Yeah.
So I think toothless is also another definition, but I think on the back of that, it also comes down to what is the cost of compliance. And I think if the perceived cost of compliance is seen as greater than the potential penalties that may be imposed, you end up in a situation where there's going to be a lot of reticence and a lot of reluctance to take on and implement these measures.
Yeah. Yes, I feel like, as you mentioned, the cost of compliance is a very big thing, because if a cost analysis is done, operators of critical infrastructure can basically see that it's not worth their money. They rather just pay the fine, and that kind of makes the act not applicable anymore, because no one's complying with it, and it's kind of going against its initial purpose.
Yeah, and I think probably another thing to highlight is that we want to move away from this compliance tick box based approach to, yes, I'm submitting everything that I need in order to comply, versus an outcomes and a resilience based approach where the outcome is achieving these real world security outcomes, real world resilience in the face of potential threats and risks. And that's the objective, and that's what SOCI wants to achieve. And I think that kind of segues us into this whole all hazards approach, which we really want to try and emphasize upon and talk about, because also as a security consultant servicing critical infrastructure clients, we need to start to educate them on the need to take this all hazards approach to risk management, security risk management, as opposed to purely looking at it from a cyber only perspective. All hazards kind of opens it up to a whole range of different hazards, and I think some of the ones we've mentioned so far, but there's also a lot of emerging hazards that we'll unpack over the next few minutes.
Yeah, so I think the all hazards approach is something that's really important. So it doesn't only encompass cyber hazards, but it also encompasses personnel hazards, supply chain hazards, and physical and natural hazards. So all these hazards are interconnected, so they all need to be looked at separately as well as together. And I think that's a very important thing that not a lot of critical infrastructure operators are looking at. So the interconnectedness is, I think, a crucial point.
Yeah, so with these hazard categories that you've mentioned, do you want to unpack that a little bit for our listeners in terms of what you mean by personnel hazards, supply chain hazards, and physical and natural hazards?
Yeah, so personnel hazards are they include insider threats, and those things can be mitigated through operators conducting background checks, and it's basically got to do with the critical workers within critical infrastructure. And supply chain hazards, they are mapped all the way to original equipment and manufacturers. So who supplies your equipment, and what if there's a vulnerability there? What should operators do in that sense?
And often supply chain goes well beyond purely the equipment side as well. There's a lot of software and software provider supply chains, and even with hardware supply chains, there's firmware for that. And often the vulnerabilities sort of come into that, and you might just have a standard update being propagated across the system, which could have been done by a nefarious actor, and all of a sudden you're compromised, not because you had a weak cybersecurity posture, but simply because you allowed for a legitimate bit of equipment to be upgraded by who you thought was an authorized update provider.
Yeah, I think that's something really important, the hardware side to things. So thank you for mentioning that. And then lastly, the physical and natural hazards. So physical security hazards, those are crucial things that need to be considered. So that's something like unauthorized access to critical infrastructure, and that's especially important because of they basically they're basically a backdoor to all essential services. So if someone's gaining unauthorized access to that, that's something that needs to be looked at, and measures need to be implemented to prevent that. And there's also the aspect of natural hazards that aren't often looked at. So that's something like bushfires in surrounding areas that can in turn affect the critical infrastructure assets.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously you've got bushfires, you've got floods, you've got and some of those are actually impacted upon by climate change as well. So you've got this linkage of risks, and this sort of comes into the overall threat environment that we're trying to evaluate and mitigate.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I think also on the back of the conflict in the Middle East, we've also seen risks to data centers from drones, which is a bit of an emerging thing. So again, one of the key things that we want to highlight here is that to be aware of these risk factors, and yes, events happening have highlighted how critical it could be if a drone were able to take out a data center or part of a data center. But at the same time, for us, from a preparedness perspective, it's important that even in Australia we are looking at drone recognition and systems which can respond to a potential drone threat, because again, these are quite low cost sort of threat vectors, and that's been one of the takeaways, I guess, from the Middle East conflict, is that you've got to watch out for even these things within a military or a non-military context as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially with the growing threat landscape. You need to consider everything, and nothing's out of the question.
Yeah, and then I think moving on from there into the higher levels, I guess you can call it, of SOCI, which is looking at systems of natural significance. What are these, and why is this applicable to data centers?
Yeah, so data centers may be deemed as a system of national significance. So critical infrastructure will be deemed as a system of national significance if the Minister of Home Affairs declares it as that. And if it is declared as a system of national significance, operators have enhanced cybersecurity obligations that they need to abide by. So this is just an additional layer to ensure that the assets are secure, especially from a cyber perspective, because they do house lots of important equipment that needs to be looked after. So this includes like real-time threat pictures and sharing mandatory vulnerability assessments. So this kind of ensures that operators have done their due diligence, conducted assessments, and they know what potential risks their assets are exposed to, and they can also implement mitigation measures to try and prevent these risks. So this isn't applicable to all data centers, but if it is a system of national significance, then they need to comply with these additional ESCOs, which is enhanced cybersecurity obligations.
Yeah, and I think on the flip side of it as well, for these data centers or systems of national significance, once they kind of get to that status, they're able to also tap into a lot more support in terms of their resilience posture, in terms of the Australian government, the support that's provided to them in terms of response provided and assistance from the government in that side of things, but also within an overall defence landscape, these become systems that are protected by Australia from a defence perspective as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's move on from that and talk a little bit about emerging threats as well, because this was something that was brought up in the independent review. It's important that when we look at this all hazards approach to risk assessment, that we're actually also looking at potential emerging threats and future threats that come onto the landscape. And the idea is you're developing a fairly adaptive risk framework, a security risk management system that allows you to modulate your level of response, your preparedness, and also your resilience posture based on the intelligence that you receive in terms of the threats that are out there, the likelihood, the consequences of these threats within a risk framework, but also importantly looking at how this landscape is changing all of the time and being able to respond in a live manner, as opposed to purely documenting it and just not being able to respond because your documents are out of date.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you mentioned future threats, because a lot of these assessments don't really consider that. But the problem with that is if they don't consider future threats, they're only equipping themselves and protecting themselves of things that they think exist right now. And I guess the consequence of that is they'll have to kind of conduct vastly regular risk assessments. So instead of doing a yearly audit, they'll have to do something like a quarterly one, which in turn takes up more time and more resources. So I think it's really important that these risk assessments are tailored to future threats as well.
Yeah, and I think with the emerging side of things, the emerging threats, we're looking at things like artificial intelligence, threats within the use of artificial intelligence frameworks, but also AI-enabled attacks.
Yeah.
We're also looking at things such as quantum cryptography. Obviously, that's not here yet, but there needs to be a lot of preparation from the perspective of as soon as that ability is there to break cryptography, we need to have post-quantum cryptography deployed in protecting our assets. Then there's also things such as the interconnectivity and space-based assets, which is another emerging threat side of things in terms of a threat actor's ability to jam space-based signals, to stop access to even simple systems like GPS that are core to timing and other systems that are used in critical infrastructure. This starts to sort of build in terms of its relevance, depending on the situation, depending on what's happening from a geopolitical perspective, what's happening from kinetic or military threats that a country might be facing, as we've seen in the Middle East, but also what's happening from a constant cyber warfare perspective that the world is already immersed in constantly. So I think these emerging threats are pretty important. One is to be able to understand the technology that enables it and prevents or mitigates the threats rather. And then at the same time being able to then deploy resilience architectures within your thinking, within your security posture, so that you're able to withstand and respond to attacks when they do happen.
Yeah, I think that's especially important with the rise of grey zone warfare as well. So attacks, they basically just cripple critical infrastructure if they're not equipped to handle them. So I think it's really important they highlighted that.
Yeah. And I think we've touched upon this already, but I think also looking at drones being very low cost and the ability of threat actors to acquire these drones in a fairly simplistic manner, and despite a lot of regulations in place from a civil aviation authority perspective, it still means that drones can be still illegally deployed and used by threat actors.
Yeah, I think the drones are basically, they're a very big physical threat vector that the SOCI Act doesn't really address, so it's kind of a gap within the SOCI Act. But critical infrastructure operators need to equip themselves to respond to those threats, especially that you mentioned that they can be illegally deployed. So that risk needs to be addressed, and measures should be put in place to ensure that the assets are protected, especially from drones. And like you mentioned as well, the space-based threats. Yeah, that's quite important as well. Yeah,
and I think a lot of security risk assessments will kind of almost miss out these critical pieces when they're going through identifying risks. When you're thinking about physical security risks, when you're looking at cybersecurity risks, OT risks that we've mentioned, personnel risks, supply chain risks, and then all of a sudden you're saying there's space-based risks as well, emerging risks, categories that we've identified. So it could even be a supply chain risk that's embedded in the AI framework that you're using, or it could be a supply chain risk that's linked to a vulnerability that will compromise your space-based communication, for example. So there's a lot happening and a lot of interconnectivity within the system. So having the ability to identify these risks, but I think importantly also to bring in the stakeholders that understand the system, that can know what to do when that system is affected or compromised, and how they're going to work around that to maintain operations or to maintain the service that they're delivering, is also key to any security risk management framework.
Yeah, when it comes to risk assessments and risk frameworks, I honestly think it just goes to thinking outside the box and what threats can impact you in the future, rather than looking at it from a surface level. So I think that's something that's really important that operators of critical infrastructure need to think about.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I think it's been very insightful going through all of that, and I think one of the things as we close it up, we want to look at a way forward. So looking at specifically data centers, if you're a data center operator or data center owner that's listening to us, what's the takeaway? What are we saying to them?
I think it's honestly just moving beyond a tick box for compliance and looking at it as an informed risk treatment, and just employing the necessary people that you think can do the job when it comes to risk assessments, and looking at it from a broader perspective. I think that's something really important, especially for data centers. As we mentioned earlier, they kind of underpin all essential services, so they need to be adequately protected.
And I think, as Dr. Slay mentions, that there is maturity-based tiering that rewards this stronger security posture, which really needs to be what happens, where we're rewarding stronger security resilience, stronger postures, proactive security, as opposed to purely just saying, look, there's a slap on the wrist or a fine if you're not complying.
Yeah, exactly. Like, security shouldn't be an administrative burden. It's a strategic imperative, and I think it needs to be looked at it that way. Yeah,
I love that. And I think, again, this kind of starts to align with what is seen as international best practice. And I think Dr. Slay unpacks some of this in the UK model that she mentions in the review, seeing infrastructure protection as a way to maintain social cohesion. And also that systems... if these systems and our security is robust, then it also means that the society stays resilient.
Yeah, security is everyone's responsibility, not only those that work in the field.
Well said, and I think as we always say here, security is the price of our digital economy. Ameeraa, thank you for joining us today with this very informative session.
My pleasure.
Now that we've wrapped up our discussion on security and the ways we protect people from external threats, it's a natural step to look at another critical aspect of safety. Not all risks come from intentional harm. Some arise from the environments we live and work in every day. With that in mind, we're shifting our focus to fire safety. It's a different topic, but it carries the same goal: safeguarding lives and ensuring resilience. Let's dive into the next segment.
Welcome back to Lote Notes. Today we're tackling a topic that's everywhere, yet somehow still invisible: lithium-ion batteries.
They power our phones, cars, public transport, warehouses, bikes, and increasingly, they shape how fires start and spread and have become a larger risk as they get implemented more and more in current technologies.
And that's the key point today. Lithium-ion batteries aren't a future risk, they are a current normalized one. We've quietly accepted them as part of everyday life, but fire services, emergency responders, and safety professionals are dealing with incidents that challenge decades of assumptions.
So today we're going to ask, have we normalized lithium-ion batteries faster than we've adapted our fire and safety thinking?
Let's start with how fast these batteries are being deployed. In New South Wales alone, public transport is being completely transformed. From July 2027, all electric buses, trains, and light rail services will run on renewable energy under a $1.9 billion deal announced by the Minns government. Over 500 electric buses are already operating, with thousands more planned to fully replace diesel buses across the state.
That means huge concentrations of lithium-ion batteries in depots, charging hubs, maintenance facilities, often in urban environments. And to be clear, this isn't about being anti-renewables or anti-EV. It's about recognizing that scale changes risk.
When one battery fails, that's an incident. When hundreds or thousands fail, that's a different category of emergency.
Now let's look at what happens when lithium-ion batteries risk goes wrong at scale. In Shenzhen, China, a massive fire destroyed more than 1,000 BYD electric test vehicles at a storage site earlier this month. Investigations cited contractor safety breaches as a contributing factor.
That's not a crash, not a flood. That's stored vehicles catching fire.
And once lithium-ion packs ignite, they don't behave like conventional fires. Thermal runaway causes self-sustaining reactions, reignition, and extreme heat outputs. This incident highlights something crucial. The risk isn't just on the road, it's in yards, ports, factories, and even testing facilities. Places we've historically protected with suppression systems designed for very different fuels.
If that feels distant, let's bring it back home to Australia. Earlier this month, a serious fire broke out at a lithium-ion battery recycling facility in Perth, triggering a hazmat emergency warning. Fire authorities confirmed there were about 80 tons of lithium-ion batteries inside the facility. Crews initially attempted an internal attack and very quickly realized it wasn't safe. They switched to an external suppression strategy to protect firefighters first.
That says a lot. Fires where the safest option is don't go inside fundamentally challenge how we think about industrial fire protection.
Residents were told to stay indoors, close windows, turn off air conditioners because lithium-ion fires aren't just about flames. They release toxic and corrosive smoke. And this was a recycling facility, the end of the battery life cycle that gets far less attention than shiny new EVs. The green story doesn't end at the showroom.
There's one more place where lithium-ion risk really comes into focus, and that's where these batteries are deployed at scale. Battery Energy Storage Systems, or BESS, is lithium-ion technology concentrated into containerized systems supporting the grid.
And when failures occur in BESS environments, they're not small events. They involve thousands of cells, long duration fires, toxic smoke, and significant exclusion zones.
That's why we're seeing a much sharper focus globally and here in Australia on how these systems are designed, protected, and responded to.
Which brings us to something genuinely relevant for anyone working in fire safety, risk engineering, or critical infrastructure. The Fire Protection Association of Australia is hosting a battery energy storage system safety masterclass focused specifically on lithium-ion BESS and the application of NFPA 855, NFPA 68, and NFPA 69.
It's being held on Friday, 8th of May from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. at the Langham in Melbourne, and the speaker lineup is worth paying attention to. One of the presenters is Dr. Magrabi, Director of Fire and Risk Engineering at Lote Consulting, and yes, our very own.
Dr. Magrabi brings deep expertise in performance-based fire engineering, lithium-ion risk, and large-scale energy systems, exactly the skill set these BESS discussions demand. He is joined by Nicholas Bartlett, Senior Fire Protection Engineer at ATAR Fire, bringing practical system-level experience into how these standards are applied in real projects.
And that's the critical point here. This isn't theoretical. When you're talking about NFPA 855, explosion venting under NFPA 68, or deflagration prevention under NFPA 69, you're acknowledging that BESS sites behave very differently to traditional plant rooms or substations. This is lithium-ion risk management at its most serious, where design decisions directly influence firefighter safety, community impact, and asset survivability.
And it reinforces the theme of today's episode. Lithium-ion batteries aren't inherently reckless, but deploying them at a scale without adapting our standards, assumptions, and expertise absolutely is. BESS forces us to confront the reality head-on.
So what have we actually normalized?
We've normalized charging bikes in apartments, storing EVs bumper to bumper, stockpiling batteries, waiting for recycling or shipping. We've also normalized the idea that suppression systems designed for paper, diesel, or plastics will somehow handle lithium-ion fires. And firefighters are telling us clearly that many of these fires behave beyond traditional assumptions. This isn't fear-mongering, it's risk literacy.
Before we wrap up, there's one more dimension to this conversation that's important because it shifts what responsibility looks like.
And this is where it gets really interesting from a fire safety perspective. Earlier this month, researchers in China published results on a sodium-ion battery that demonstrate zero thermal runaway even under extreme abuse testing. That includes nail penetration and exposure to temperatures over 300, up to 300 degrees Celsius, with no smoke, no fire, and no explosion. And this wasn't achieved with firefighting systems or external suppression. It was done inside the battery itself. The battery uses non-flammable polymerizable electrolyte that literally changes state when temperatures rise. Above about 150 degrees, it forms an internal solid barrier that blocks heat propagation and stops chain reactions before they can even spread.
That's a fundamentally different failure behavior to lithium ion.
Exactly, and that is the point. This research shows that violent thermal runaway is not a law of physics. It's not inevitable. It's a consequence of the battery chemistry we've chosen to normalize. Lithium-ion batteries prioritize energy density, weight, and costs. But when they fail catastrophically. This sodium-ion design proves batteries can fail without turning into fires.
Now, to be clear, this technology isn't what's installed in our cars, depots, apartments, or even recycling plants today. Commercial scale-up is still a few years away, with cost parity projected closer to 2027 or 2028, which means lithium-ion batteries are going to dominate for the foreseeable future.
But the reason this matters right now is perspective.
Exactly, because it reframes how we should think about lithium-ion fire risk. This isn't residual risk that can be avoided. It's accepted risk based on commercial and deployment decisions. And when safer failure modes are possible, the burden doesn't sit solely with firefighters, building managers, or emergency responders. It sits with designers, manufacturers, policymakers, and the standards we continue to rely on.
So when we normalize lithium-ion batteries everywhere, in transport fleets, basements, warehouses, and recycling facilities, we are also normalizing a failure behavior that requires extraordinary emergency response when things go wrong. And the uncomfortable conclusion is this: we've adapted our cities and systems to batteries faster than we've adapted our safety models, even though better outcomes are technically achievable.
Which means the question going forward isn't just, how do we fight these fires? It's, why are we still designing systems that expect us to?
Lithium-ion batteries are now critical infrastructure, not consumer novelties. They intersect the fire safety, environmental health, emergency response, and building design.
I think the question isn't whether we should adopt them. That decision's already been made. The real question is, have our fire strategies, emergency plans, and regulations kept pace with how lithium-ion batteries have become the new norm? Because normalizing the technology without normalizing the risk management is how incidents become disasters.
That's it for this episode of Lote Notes. If this conversation has made you uncomfortable, that's probably the point.
Stay safe, stay critical, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Lote Notes podcast. If you found today's insights helpful, be sure to subscribe and share the podcast with colleagues who care about fire safety, physical security, and cybersecurity. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and join us next time as we continue tracking the events and trends shaping the world of safety and resilience. Until then, stay safe and secure.